This podcast is sponsored by Camera Museum of London at 44 Museum Street. Welcome to a Fish Out of Water podcast. This is your host, Richard Lipman. Today, we are interviewing Stephen Rosenfield. Hello.
Hi.
Is this Stephen?
Hey, Richard.
Thanks for joining me.
Pleasure.
Sure. So I'm going to dive right into some questions right now.
Let's do it.
So maybe this is, a sort of fictitious set of questions here, but I'm coming from the point of view of the person who's into comedy, but has got a low self-esteem of themselves.
No, that's no such person exists.
Let's imagine that the person who's really interested in comedy, maybe that person deep down has a desire for attention, or maybe he's thinking, I'm a loser, I'm not good enough, I can't do a scene, I can't remember a scene, no one cares. What do you say to those kind of ideas, concepts, emotions?
You have all the makings of a comedian.
I see. Why do you say that?
Well, it takes a certain degree of narcissism, a bit of narcissism to want to be any kind of performer, to want to put yourself out there. Comedy, the basic subject of comedy is about our struggles. So if you're a person who feels, intensely about your own struggles, that's the golden subject of comedy. So none of those, virtually everything you say is an asset.
I see. There are certain quarters of thinking that says narcissism, or, when one is thinking about oneself and not necessarily about the subject or audience, can be extremely destructive, and you kind of reach a glass ceiling where you're not able to go further.
I'm not talking about Trump, Richard. I'm talking about a comedian.
Trump is a fantastic comedian.
I'm maybe narcissism is the wrong word, but what I'm saying is that to be in a profession where you're out front, where the very nature of your job, like your job, for instance, is that people are going to be watching you, that takes a certain, I don't mean extreme, destructive degree of narcissism, but you gotta enjoy that. I mean, that's part of it, and some people enjoy that, and that's part of the gig for sure. I don't mean rampant narcissism.
Okay.
I mean just enough so that you enjoy being in front of people.
Can you give us an example of all the traits that kind of makes a comedian bloom in your personal experience?
Okay, well, talent is part of it, but it's not the whole thing by any means. And I think that one of the things that's being recognized, not only about stand-up, but about many artists, is that a lot of it has to do with work. And a lot of it has to do with your appetite for work. Because a lot of it is hard work. Of course, talent, but talent is not enough. Without that hard work, I think about somebody like, not a comedian, but, Fred Astaire, the great dancer and movie star. I mean, he was famous for, they'd be done for the day and he wouldn't go home because he'd be working. I mean, he'd be working beyond, the normal sort of regime and routine, working to make his sequences as fabulous as he could. And that's a mindset that really needs to be there for somebody who's going to make it as a comedian, as well as for someone who's going to make it in any of the arts. And then I think the mysterious part of it, really, and I don't, and there's really, in my judgment, no accounting for it, is that some people have this, I really think, kind of God-given ability to keep growing. Some people just keep getting better and better, better. And why that is, I don't know. And some people plateau. Some people put in a lot of work and they reach a certain level, but then that's kind of as far as they're going to go. And again, it's not because they're not working hard at it. It's just this mysterious thing. The folks who become terrific are the folks who have talent, who work really hard. And I mean, I say talent is work and genius is obsession with work. People who work really, really hard at it and who have this capacity to keep growing, to keep getting better.
How do you obtain discipline then? What if one sort of loses interest? I mean, do you have to force yourself to do stuff?
If you're forcing yourself to do it, you probably shouldn't do it, because here, let me say this, the people who become really terrific comedians, and again, I think this isn't only true of comedy, I think this is true of artists in general. It's really a calling. It's a calling. It's more of a calling than it is a job or career. They kind of have to do it. It's like they have to. I mean, they couldn't not do it. So, I mean, does the work sometimes get hard? Yes. Is it possible that the work gets tedious? Yes. All of those things is possible. But is there a real option not to do it? No, there isn't. It's interesting because the folks that I've worked with that have gone on to really significant careers in comedy, one of the things that they had in common was their thinking was not, I'm going to give myself a year, or I'm going to give myself 2 years or 4. They didn't think that way. That was not a question. They were doing this. Where their minds were focused on is, I'm going to do everything I can do to get as good at this as I possibly can. And that's their mindset.
Do you have any you've written a book called Mastering Stand-Up. How long did it take you to write that book?
It took me, I think it took maybe a little more than a year to write it. But the thing is, I had been doing this for decades. So in a sense, it was really written before I sat down to write it. I mean, I don't mean to dismiss the actual writing of it, because I wanted it to be a well-written book, but I knew what it was that I wanted to write about before I started writing the book.
Did you get help to write the book? Like, was there a ghostwriter involved or someone to look over stuff?
Richard,
Was there editorial?
what a thing to say.
Sorry.
I wouldn't ask you if somebody was lip syncing this interview. Of course I wrote it myself.
Okay.
I forgive you.
Thank you very
But
much.
you're on thin ice.
Um, what about humor in different continents? Is that something you've experienced?
I have. Um, I've worked in Mexico and I've worked in Portugal and I've worked in Sweden and I've worked in a lot of countries in Norway. Um, and what I found is that the essence of it is the same everywhere. And by the essence, I mean the stuff of comedy is about our struggles, with life. And those tend to be kind of the same wherever you are. I mean, struggles in our relationships, in our work. Um, so the soul of it is really similar. Having said that, there are differences. There are definite cultural differences. Let me give you an example. I did a lot of work in Portugal, and when I was there, I was working with writers and performers to develop actually a sketch comedy industry for them. And they were great. I loved them. And they did this one sketch that there was part of it I didn't understand. It was a unemployment agency that people with jobs went to get unemployed. They were people who, it was an agency for people who felt that they were really seriously stuck in a job and couldn't see a way out.
Right.
Um, and there was some fun there. One of the people, so there was the person who was the person from the agency, and then all of these, clients came in to get his advice. And one of them was a plastic surgeon who was making so much money that his relatives were all over him because they knew he was rich and they all wanted money and they wanted to tell him what he should do with his money, and he couldn't stand it. And there were several like that, which were immediately accessible and funny. But then there was an actor, a guy who came in playing an actor who wanted to get unemployed. And in the United States, that just didn't make I mean, from my viewpoint, that didn't make sense. I mean, it's like that's just not wouldn't cross the mind of an actor in the United States. But that was a cultural thing because, and this is what I learned, is that at that time in Portugal, actors didn't have a union. They didn't really have agents or managers. And the result of that is that you could have a job as a featured actor, let's say in a soap opera or a dramatic series or a comedy series, and not make enough money from that series to support yourself. They were so poorly paid. The result of it was they had to have 2 or 3 jobs at the same time, and they would very often have to travel from, Lisbon to Porto. Their work day was just really stressful,
Hmm.
and I didn't know that. But that to me is a really good example of a cultural thing where if you didn't live there and if you weren't familiar with that situation, you wouldn't know why it was funny. But when it comes to subjects like dating or marriage or those sort of fundamental or your colleagues at work, your career, those basic subjects, love, sex, death, um, of comedy. This it's pretty universal.
Can you tell us, can you recall an incredible comedic moment that you would like to tell us? I mean, who are your favorite comedians? Who can people draw from in order to get a bit of something? Or should people watch comedians live to get? Inspiration.
Okay, so you're talking about folks who want to do comedy.
Yes.
Um, well, it's really important to study. This is part of the work. You want to study the people that by your lights, not by my lights, but by your lights, you think are terrific. And you want to study them. And part of what you blessedly have not asked me yet, for which I am grateful, and why I forgive you for the ghostwriter remark, is that usually pretty early on, I'm asked the question, can comedy be taught? And of course the answer is yes. And the thing is that there is a tremendous amount of technique that has to be learned to write comedy and to perform comedy. Very, very technical skills. And these are things that you can learn, and these are things that you have to learn. And these are things that it's just wonderful and invaluable to see how comedians you really love and admire apply those fundamental techniques of writing and performing, their way of doing those things. And that can open up a lot of possibilities in your own mind. It's not, let me say this, it's not at all atypical that comedians will have another comedian in their head when they start performing and writing. And it's really interesting because Woody Allen, when he started as a comedian, interestingly, was doing Bob Hope in his head. He loved Bob Hope. And in his mind, he was doing Bob Hope, but because he was Woody Allen, of course, no one ever made the connection. There was a connection in his mind. There was a connection. And it's not at all uncommon that very often people who are starting have someone that they really love in their heads when they start writing and performing. And then eventually their work becomes more and more their own and original. But yeah, I mean, the answer to your question is study the comedians that you really love and admire. Those are the ones that you want to learn from.
How do you study them?
Well, you study them you really do buy my book. You do need to learn the fundamentals of writing stand-up and the fundamentals of performing stand-up. You need to know those techniques. So for instance, the basic format of writing stand-up is a structure called setup and punchline. Okay, setup and punchline. Sometimes when people hear setup and punchline, they think about bum kind of jokes, but it doesn't mean it's a writing structure. It has nothing to do with you could be doing jokes about Immanuel Kant, okay? You could be doing Spinoza jokes and not mother-in-law jokes. They would still need to be in setup and punchline form. And what that means in terms of the craft is that there needs to be a setup, and the setup needs to have one subject and only one subject in it, and it needs to tee up the punch. And every setup should have a punchline, which is the line that's going to trigger the laugh. And that's the basic structure of stand-up comedy writing. And when you know that, then one of the things that you can learn from is seeing how other comedians apply that structure to their work. That's the way you really learn.
That structure, how long has it been around for? Has it been around since the ancient Greeks?
Yeah, it has been really. And it's not only stand-up, it's really there in all forms of comedy. There's certain elements that make it work. Surprise is probably the main reason why people laugh, is because they're surprised by what happens or by what you say. So, for instance, one of the qualities of a good setup, whether it be in a movie or in a television show or in a stand-up act, is that it doesn't give away the laugh. So that it tees it up in a way where you know what the subject is, but you're going to be surprised by the way it plays out. And yes, those things have been part of comedy from the very, very beginning.
Is there comedy in Shakespeare?
Absolutely. I mean, that's part of what, I mean, I guess part of what's mind-boggling, among the things that are mind-boggling about Shakespeare, is that he was great at both tragedy and comedy. I mean, more often with writers and playwrights, they're usually terrific at one of those things. It's pretty rare that you find somebody terrific at both of those things. But yeah, absolutely. In fact, I have this theory that the reason why the prologue, by the way, Romeo and Juliet starts out, is by the prologue coming out and saying these two houses, star-crossed lovers, this is going to be a tragedy, is that when that audience came in, saw that it was set in Italy, saw that it involved young people in love, they would assume it was going to be a comedy. I mean, that is the way the comedies open up. You're usually in Italy, you're with young people, and they're in love, and there are obstacles.
Is that well, I interviewed someone about the origins of Shakespeare, and he's got various theories that in fact perhaps it was someone else who wrote.
Absolutely, sure. The Earl of Oxford is probably who we're talking about.
So there's a bit of controversy. Amelia Lenier, I think. Um, anyway, we don't know. And of course, this is not something that is discussed. It's not public debate. People take it for what it is, Shakespeare. Is there something about Italy though that brings out people's passions and hearts and minds and tragedy and war and comedy more than any other nation?
I think so. I do think so. I think part of it is certainly at the time that Shakespeare was writing, the Roman Empire was such a reality and so central in the minds of creative people. And there was so much to admire. There was such admiration for their art, for their painting, for their music, for their whole culture, for their food. There was a sensuousness. There is a sensuousness still. I mean, I adore Italy. There's still a sensuousness to Italy. I mean, if you're going to fall in love, it's way more fun to do that in Italy than, like Iceland or someplace like that.
Have you ever fallen in love in Italy?
I've certainly fallen in love with Italy a lot.
There's also quite today's comedians are they as good as 20 years ago, or is AI sort of dictating the terms? Chat shows is a big thing now, but it was always quite popular in the West, at least since I don't know, the 50s and 60s. Do you think there's a bit of a saturation, or are we lacking some originality now?
I have this theory that there's always this small group of just terrific comedians. When things are saturated, there's still that small group of terrific comedians. When they're not saturated, there's still that group of terrific comedians. And I think whatever the situation is, that's going to be the case. The chat shows, we call them talk shows here, were a great stimulus for stand-up comedy in the United States. I mean, they had a lot to do with the popularity of stand-up comedy, and so that wouldn't be an impediment. Certainly, it was not only an outlet, but particularly in the days of Johnny Carson, who may or may not be known by some of the your non-American audience members, but he was the great talk show host of The Tonight Show. And not only was his, and one of the things that he loved doing was to find, which he made a great effort to do, his show did, really talented, unknown comedians nationally and give them their debut on his show. I mean, he virtually launched an entire generation of stand-ups. So those shows don't hurt stand-up by any means. I think when people ask now, they're wondering, like, does the woke culture, has that hurt it? And, does political correctness hurt it? And are there too many things that you can't say now? Or, are there too many taboos now? And, there are always taboos. I mean, there are always taboos. I mean, so it honest to God doesn't matter. I mean, as long as you're living in a place where they won't shoot you for what you say, you can navigate whatever the restrictions are to create really terrific comedy.
Do you have a sort of scheme for people to, become part of your training or your academy or school? Let's imagine that they're in a different part of the world.
Well, what we're doing is just been a great thing, because my comedy workshops, my stand-up workshops are offered a few times a year, entirely virtually, which is really exciting. It's so exciting because they're comprised of one-on-one sessions, like a one-on-one, like you and I are having now, where we focus on the writing. And then there are group sections where it gives people the opportunity to perform. And they're literally, there are times when there are people in that same, in those little Zoom boxes from virtually all over the world, which is just great. It's wonderfully exciting. So in terms of, if you were asking in terms of people who may want to work with me on developing their comedy because of this technology, that's now possible.
What was your motivation to branch out into the stand-up world, into comedy?
That's a good question. Well, comedy was always really important to me. I mean, I think comedy is a language that certain people speak, frankly. And for better and for worse, I spoke it. I say that because sometimes when you're young, if you speak it, it can be problematic. Um, but it's a language that I've always spoken, and I've always been drawn to it. The specific answer to your question is this. I was making my living as a director in the theater. And in the 80s, there was a tremendous stand-up comedy boom in the United States. And things did get saturated, actually, then. It's like cable television just came into being. And like that was, there were only basically two things you could see on cable television back then: porn and stand-up. And the reason why stand-up was so popular, and by the way, that's true anytime. It's interesting thing is that anytime there's a development of a new platform, whether it be what we're doing now, or Instagram, or Facebook, or radio, or television, comedy, and very often stand-up is in the forefront of that movement. And the reason is you don't need anything. You just need a funny person. There are no technical requirements. If you got a cable channel and you got to fill it all day, get comedians on there. No sets, no props. So there was a big boom going on then. And I lived in New York City, and in between directing jobs, I would coach actors. I would coach them for auditions, or if they were already cast, we'd work on their roles together, for television, for film. And there were a couple of comedians who had seen a review that I had done off Broadway, a comedy review, and they really loved it. And they sought me out and asked if I'd work with them. And I said, sure. And when I started working with them, I realized that part of what needed work was their writing. It wasn't just a matter of performing the way it is when I work with actors. They have the challenging role of interpreting a piece of writing that somebody else has written. But in stand-up, you're the one responsible for the writing. That doesn't necessarily mean you're the only one working on it, but you're the one who's responsible. So I found myself rewriting some of their material just out of pure need. It's like they had a gig at the end of the week, and it was Tuesday, and they had stuff that just was not working, and we had to fix it. And that was as important as, how they were going to deliver it. And so go ahead.
I see. And it worked, right?
And it worked.
The audiences were laughing, they were booked. Did they get an agent? They had an agent?
Well, interesting. I mean, yes, is the short answer. No, they didn't have agents. One of the things that I love about stand-up is you don't need one. As a stand-up here,
Ah, yeah.
you can get on stage without an agent or a manager. I mean, they really don't play a role in getting booked in clubs. They become significant. Let me say also that being a stand-up is part of a hyphenated career for a comedian. Almost nobody is just a stand-up. That almost doesn't exist. If you're a successful stand-up, you're a stand-up, you're an actor, you're a writer, you're a director, you're a producer. It's a hyphenated career. And where agents become important is in those other areas, in the acting, in the writing, in the directing areas. To get launched as a comedian, at least in the United States, as far as getting booked in clubs, agents don't really have much of any role to play.
For those struggling comedians out there, or wannabes, obviously it's great to talk about the ones who've made it. They probably write books, they give interviews, and you get quite a lot of insight. How much of that is true from the successful comedians, and how much of it is made up, do you
Of
think?
what they have to say about themselves?
Yes.
Wow, you are asking, man, is that a juicy question? Wow, I'm going to have to restrain myself. Um, because some of it is such utter bullshit that, if if you're in on it, your eyes roll at the gall that they have. And some of them are very candid about it. I think, here, let me say this. I do want to make this point. Traditionally, comedians always had writers. Just as singers, traditionally, sang the work of composers, and the pop singers would sing, Gershwin and who Irving Berlin and Rodgers and Hammerstein. That it was never in vogue. I mean, people didn't think about whether or not a singer was singing stuff that he or she wrote themselves. I mean, they just assumed that they weren't. And that was the case with comedy. And you needed writers in order to have a career. And then when the Beatles hit in the 60s, they wrote their own music. And that really upended pop music big time. There was a thing now where to really be the authentic uh, 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 artist, you had to write it as well as sing it, which of course isn't true. But I mean that became sort of what was definitely in vogue in terms of notions of authenticity. So that became true also of stand-ups, that they position, if to answer your question about how true are their memoirs, the one thing that's like a through line that's usually not true is that they usually never now, because ever since the 60s, it's been a thing about working, writing everything yourself. That there's a tendency not to acknowledge the work of the people that you're writing with. And all of them had writers. All of them did. I mean, somebody like Richard Pryor, I mean, even the most personal, edgy of comedians, like Pryor's a great example. I mean, Paul Muni wrote with him. And of course, Woody Allen, who was much more open about it, had, worked with writers on his comedy. So I would say the one area where comedians who write their memoirs may fudge the truth, and it's galling to people like me, is that they usually pretty strongly imply that they did it all themselves.
Do you think I could come back to you in 10 minutes?
Of course you can.
10. All right. Thank you, Stephen. Send you a link soon. Oh, Stephen,
Hey,
thanks again. To
yeah.
continue, part two. How much, how far should the person or comedian be aware of the news cycle, and how it affects jokes, themes?
Well, there's some comedians who really do the news. I mean, the news is their material. The late night comedians, that's their subject is the news. So they have to be as aware of the news as a journalist. And then even on the other extreme, where a comedian's material really has nothing to do with politics or nothing to do with what's going on and culturally, or where it's really personal, where it's all about kind of their personal lives, still have to have some awareness of what's going on. You can't be oblivious. You can't be oblivious to it. um Let me give you an example. If you have some material about like a bad experience, what a drag it is, having to fly these days, you might want to not do that material if there's been some tragic airplane crash that's all over the news that day. So even if your stuff is very personal, you still need to have some sense of what the big stuff that's, if there has been big stuff going down that day.
There's quite a significant amount of British and American comedians. Is that a cultural imperialism, or is there more media attached to that than other nations? Why is that,
Oh,
or is it?
yes, Richard, I am a colonialist. I will now conduct the rest of this interview as the poop. Okay. Um, I tell you what it is. There is an American form of comedy, just like the musical theater is kind of uniquely American. I mean, other people do it wonderfully well, God knows. Rock and roll certainly started that way and greatly loved by people all over the world who made it their own. And stand-up comedy is also that way. And I don't think it's so much a matter of a kind of colonial or imperialist sort of takeover. I think it's admired. It's admired. People love it. And they want to know how to do it. It's like they want to do that, just the way aspiring pop star, in the 50s or the early 60s, when rock and roll was first happening and really happening here, would think, well, like the Beatles. I mean, I want to do that. It's more that, I think, than anything. It is more that.
Okay, well, it sounds like it's a tradition, right?
It's right. It's an art it's an art form that some people really love.
How do comedians, or just about anyone, it's not only involving comedy, but how do people remember their lines?
It's just work. It's just it's just nothing more or less than saying it over and over. It's the same thing for an actor. It's interesting. Um, there are performances that certain theaters have where they call them talkbacks. It's where they invite the audience to stay after the show to talk to the actors. And inevitably, the first question or the second question is always, how did you possibly learn all of those lines? And the answer, it's just work. That's what it is. It's just repetition over and over and over again. It's the long and short of it.
What happens if one is lazy? Can one improvise on stage?
Well, you can improvise on stage. Here, let me, here, I want to make this point to you.
Hmm.
In joke writing, in stand-up comedy writing, joke by joke by joke, there's a point where you nail it. It's 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 just right. And you want to do it exactly that way. You don't want to change a word. You don't want to change a word of it. It's a script. It becomes a script. And you do that script and you wanted to, it would be like an actor coming out and going to be, or, maybe some days I just feel like maybe not to be. I mean, no, you got to do it to be. It's the way it's written. And it's the same in a comedy set. There comes a point where you really nail it. You've really got it. And then you do it that way, over and over. That's the way it's a script. It becomes a script. And that becomes memorized. That's your show. And again, the mindset of a comedian, it's the same thing as an actor. You would never find an actor and say, well, I just don't want to put in the time to memorize the role. It was like, what? It's the same thing with the comedians. Exactly. Comedians are actors. I mean, it is definitely a form of acting.
Absolutely. Were you surprised by a show you went to accidentally off Broadway somewhere, some night? Do newbies surprise you? Or is
Newbie. Oh, I see. Okay. The first thing that was coming to mind was not a newbie. Okay. And it was a Broadway show called The World According to Me. And it was done by a really great American comedian named Jackie Mason. And he did it on Broadway. And the thing that astounded me was that he had a Broadway audience literally in stitches. I mean, it was fantastic. And then because it was a Broadway show, there was an intermission, especially in those days. Sometimes now they do shows without intermissions, but when that show was done, there was an intermission. And I thought, he can't crank this back up again. He can't possibly get us back to where we were when he left us in Act One, and he did. And that was just a great, fantastic experience. As far as a newbie goes, up here, I want to make this point to you. It takes years to get really, really good at this. And there really is no such thing as an overnight sensation in stand-up comedy. That would be like saying, there's an overnight sensation in ballet. You know what I mean? I don't know what happened. They got on their toes and it just doesn't work. It doesn't work that way.
right.
So, I mean, sure, I see people that I love, but who are relatively at the beginning, but that to get to the point where somebody is going to be like, oh my God, that's really great. That there is going to be years and years of work behind that. That doesn't just happen.
Oh, one moment. Yeah. Jackie Mason. Yeah, I saw him in London. He was fantastic. I was crying. I was crying. I was leaving the theater crying. I was in the theater crying as well. Tears running down.
Right. And he's an example of why it takes time, because in addition to writing the material as well as performing it, a comedian has a third really important mission to accomplish, and that is to create who he is as the comedian. That persona, that comic persona, is a creation of theirs, and that takes years. And the reason why it takes years is that it just takes, it's a collaboration between a comedian and his or her audience that you learn from going out night after night. What subjects work for you? What subjects do they love hearing you talk about? And what subjects don't work for you?
There
And
is, yeah.
the reason why I'm mentioning Jackie Mason is that when he started out as being like self-deprecating. his comedy was really all about putting himself down. But what he became could not have been more opposite than that. He became this wonderful, cocky, opinionated uh, personality on that stage, and that took him time to find that.
Right. Yes. I notice well, a lot of people would say that. There are quite a lot of people of the Jewish faith in comedy. Is that because obviously everyone says that as well? Is because there's an element of tragedy with some of the history of what happened um, to some of the Jewish people? Would you say that's correct? Is it like that DNA? It could have been there for centuries. It's just sort of
Well, here,
coming out a little bit.
yeah. Um, I think that where the Jewish experience plays into um, creating an environment for people to get into comedy is that you got to feel a little bit like you're on the outside to be a comedian. You got to kind of have that outsider's point of view about stuff. And I think Jewish people very often find themselves in living in places where they are on the outside, and that helps in comedy for sure. And I think I mentioned
Why
this
do you say that? Why do you think it helps to be on the outside looking
because
in, so to
I
speak?
think it gives you a clarity. It can give you a clarity. You can see things freshly. If you're ensconced in it, if you're right in the middle of it, it's hard to have a fresh to see it freshly. Whereas if you're looking at it from a distance, there's a certain freshness to your perspective. Um, um, that's really, really important because part of the stock and trade. I mean, Seinfeld is a great example of this. Seinfeld was someone who, to a great extent, showed us what was ludicrous and absurd about just the regular stuff of life. Um, and that takes the ability to kind of see things a little bit at a distance, to see it freshly, to be able to see that. Whereas if you're right in the, if you're in the throes of it, it's harder to have that cool eye, that perspective.
Hmm.
Um,
Right. Interesting.
so I think and then, the other thing is that
Hmm.
I said at the beginning, really, comedy is about struggle. I say the definition of a comedian is a person who's got struggles. He's got problems. If life is great, let me say this, happiness is a wonderful thing. It is not funny. It is absolutely not funny at all. And you cannot go and have a successful career talking about how exquisitely happy your life is. People will hate you.
I see.
So I think that very oftentimes Jewish people have found themselves in struggles and in areas of life that may be less of a struggle for other people, the sort of more native born, wherever they were, social struggles and so on. And I think, Israel means to struggle with God. I mean, struggle is central to the Jewish experience. And I think that also that those are the things that I think can, that's an environment for a comic mind to develop.
Again, back to the news cycle. Does the news cycle affect, for example, the Jewish comedians, especially with wars, conflict?
It's tough. I guess part of this is there a lot of comedians that we just don't think of them as Jewish comedians. We think of them as comedians. Um, it may be, I don't know, it may be different where you are, but there are very, very few Jewish comedians. There are a lot of comedians who happen to be Jewish. But I think it's more that, just like there are comedians who happen to be Episcopalian and, and who happen to be Muslim and so on and so forth. More that than Jewish, sort of that kind of clearly ethnic kind of comedians.
What are your takes, for example, on comedians from other comedians from Turkey or from North Africa or even China or Japan or maybe even Russia or Latin America or Brazil? You noticed anything really, really of quality in those places?
Always. They're always terrific. They're terrific people everywhere. Absolutely. I'm sure this is in my book.
Mm.
I am sure that this is how stand-up started. Okay. I am sure, I'm positive about this. So a group of guys go hunting for the village, all right, and they come back at the end of the day and they're sitting with their families around the campfires and eating. And they tell about what happened that day. And one of them, I make this in my book, one of them says what he thinks the chief wants to hear. And that's the beginning of Fox News. That was the beginning of that kind of journalism where you're writing what you think the chief is going to want to hear, as opposed to maybe what actually happened. And one of them, and I am sure that, and one of them did it funny. I'm sure that's how it started. One of them just turned what happened during that day when everybody got together at the end of the day to have something to eat, made it funny. And that I'm sure that's how comedy got started. And that's going to be, there are going to be people like that everywhere, everywhere.
Do you think comedians should get drunk before they go on stage?
That's ridiculous. That's really ridiculous. I don't mean you're ridiculous, but that idea is, that makes as much sense as asking me, if you're at Wimbledon and you're in the, say, semifinals, would it be a good idea, just to loosen up, to get drunk before you get out on no, no.
Of course.
You want to be at the, and I'm glad you asked that question, actually, Richard, because it can be confusing for people, because comedy clubs here, at least, I'm sure it's probably true for you or too, they're basically bars. I mean, they're selling alcohol is really where they're making their money. So your workplace is a saloon when you're a comedian. So it's right there. But you're not the customer. Okay. You're the entertainment, and you want to be at the top of your game. And certainly getting drunk is disastrous.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I may come back to you with some other questions, but at the moment, I think we're good. I mean, final thoughts, philosophies, where do you think it's heading? Is AI going to become a comedian? Um,
No.
will AI write the scripts and the
I
punchline?
think AI can write jokes,
Oh.
because here's the thing. Here are the subjects of stand-up comedy. The subjects of stand-up comedy are how you feel about your life, your past life, your current life, your future, and how you feel about the other things that you care about. So if you care about politics, how you feel about politics, if you care about movies, whatever. And that's it. Those are the only two subjects. And And that's true of most art forms. Like, what are the subjects of painting? Okay, the subjects of painting are like what I'm looking at inside, what I'm looking at outside, or what I'm feeling. I'm feeling the feeling that I have when and that's it. So how can you be original when, when you've got two subjects? And the answer to that question is the subject in comedy is you. You are the subject. That Jackie Mason show that you and I both loved was called The World According to Me. And that was a great title because the subject of comedy is the comedian. It's that individual, it's your take on what you're experiencing. And AI, the power of AI, where AI can be, terrific, is that it can take like all the information about cancer research from all over the world, or take news stuff from all over the world and generate and take that collective information and generate a product that formerly would be created by a person. But comedy is about you. It's just you. It's your take on things. And AI doesn't function that way. AI is a collection of information that can produce certain products.
Right.
But this is not a collection. This is you.
So it starts with the personal.
It's all personal. It's all personal.
Stephen Rosenfield, thanks very much. And I'll be in touch, hopefully with this forthcoming season of my podcast.
Great. Good to talk to you.
Good chat.
Bye-bye.
This podcast is sponsored by Camera Museum of London at 44 Museum Street. Thank you for listening to a Fish Out of Water podcast. This is your host, Richard Lipman. Should you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please get in touch.